Thanks a lot, Richard. And it's great to be here with such a nice crowd, so many young people. It's very important to be in public places, to show our colors, to show who we are, to stand up, because we all know the tremendous pressure that is placed on people like us, ideas like us, every day. Well, today I'm going to talk about European origins. Basically, I became very interested in that topic. Essentially asking why are Europeans so prone to individualism? Why are we less concerned about kinship than other groups seem to be? And in particular, why are we so prone to forming groups that are not really based on kinship, but are based more on reputation or some kind of moral ideal than other groups seem to be? So the place to start, I think, these days is population genetics. I do think that there are some biological influences here. Some of these things may be culturally very complicated, and I would say this is the toughest intellectual problem there is anywhere. I mean, psychology, studying Jews is easy by comparison. But the basic picture of European population genetics is coming into focus. There's a huge amount of research now. The first group that was there, sort of primordially, were the European hunter-gatherers. 20,000 years ago, they went down with the ice ages. They receded down in southern Europe, went back up. Evolved white skin, pale eyes, light hair in that region. Then around 7,000 years ago, you had these farmers coming from the Middle East. And probably more predominant in the south, as we'll see. And then around 4,500 years ago, you had the invasion settlement of the Indo-Europeans. This was a critical event. Of course, all our languages are essentially Indo-European languages. This was a very successful group. They spread out from the Pontic Steppes in Ukraine. They had, and they went all over. They went to Anatolia, Western China, down to India, but also all throughout Europe. They had some advantages. They had the secondary products revolution. They were able to eat cheese and butter and so on. They developed a wagon with very sophisticated axles, so they could go far out in the steppes and have these very large herds. And the main thing is they domesticated the horse. And that allowed them, again, to have these larger herds, but also had quite a large military application. So these guys were essentially became a very military culture. This was, once all this was in place, they were basically an unstoppable force because they had, the basic economics were in place, the inventions of the wheel, the horse, and the military culture. Nobody could stop them. In 2500 BC. Ricardo Duchesne has a book called The Uniqueness of Western Civilization. Describes Indo-Europeans as a uniquely aristocratic people, dominated by emerging chieftains, for whom fighting to gain prestige was the all-pervading ethos. This culture is interpreted as the Western state of nature, and is a primordial source of Western restlessness. This is the Faustian spirit, the spirit of exploration, inventiveness, conquest, discovery, and so on. So essentially, these societies they were extremely hierarchical, based on an elite, which was a military elite, but this elite was relatively egalitarian within itself. But it dominated other groups. These were not particularly nice people. When they came in and dominated, they dominated, and they would enslave other people and so on, subjugate them. Three basic social classes: the slaves, free men, which would be farmers, craftsmen, and so on, and the soldiers, the actual military group. The important thing is that it was possible to have upward mobility. You had these classes, but they were not set in stone. If you were a slave, you could become free if you had the right qualities. And of course, the right qualities really had to do with being a good potential soldier of some kind. And so you had these male military groups, so-called Mannerbund in German. They were not despotic. But they were based on reputation. If you were a good soldier, you could rise. And essentially a free market system where people would choose leaders. And if the leader wasn't doing very well, they would simply depose the guy. Sometimes they'd kill him, and they would go off with somebody else who was a better leader and could get them more wealth by their adventures. So it was not tied together by kinship bonds. And that's the thing about individualism. Kinship is there, and it has a certain role in European history, but it's nowhere near as important as you see it, say, in the Middle East. And the thing about this Mannerbund is that they're above the kinship. The most important thing is your reputation. Those Mannerbund are not really based on kinship, but on how good you are as a soldier. So it's much more of a free market situation. Pursuit of fame and fortune was the entire ethos built into the culture. The prestige could only come from fame and fortune, and that meant military fame and fortune. So kinship ties were less important, and upward mobility was possible. You didn't have rigid caste lines, you didn't have rigid ethnic lines as you do in the Middle East. Still to this day, if you go to the Middle East, it's what we call a segmentary society. All the societies they're sort of cut off from each other, and then their own little enclaves and so on. That was not the case in Europe. I don't think it's ever the case in Europe, and the Indo-Europeans are no exception. There was a certain form of individualism. They allowed permeability, they allowed upward mobility. They didn't keep people in these rigid castes forever. And it's very important that so if you became one of these leaders, you had to give gifts to other people. Your reputation depended on giving gifts to others, to people who followed you. So if you had a successful campaign, you'd have all this stuff to give to people, and that would make you, have a lot of prestige. Obviously, they would want to follow you. So essentially, it's a free market system. If you're not doing well as a leader, if you get defeated, if you can't inspire the men or something like that, people are going somewhere else. Again, the ties are not based on kinship, they're based on ability. So it's much more of a free market system. It's like if one company's doing a bad job, you switch to another company because they're going to do a better job. That's exactly what we have here, sort of proto-capitalism, you might say. And it goes even beyond that. In Scandinavian society, they were expected to make their own way, even if their father had been very successful with fortune and honor. They would often bury quite a bit of the wealth with the father. So Hans Peter Hassenfratz, he's a historian of Scandinavian religion and culture, says that even if sons inherited the lands, they were unable to sustain their status if honor counted for anything unless they put themselves and their men at risk and went into battle, thereby winning for himself, each in his own turn, wealth and renown, and so following in the footsteps of his kinsmen. You had to make it on your own. And fame was really what was important here. Wealth was sort of came along with it, but the main thing was fame. And this quote from Beowulf is also in Ricardo Duchesne's book. He says, the passage is, and we must all expect to leave our life on this earth. We must earn some renown. If we can before death, daring is the thing for a fighting man to be remembered by. A man must act, so when he means to, in a fight, to frame himself a long-lasting glory. It is not life he thinks of. In other words, the most important thing is fame after death. Your life is going to be here today and gone tomorrow. You have to try to do something that people will talk about after you're gone. This is a completely militarized culture. They call it berserker fighting style. They would just get into a frenzy, like a wild animal, and they would actually, what they call shape-shifting, they would actually think that they were a wolf or a bear when they went into a fight. They would sort of become, go into an altered state where it's a complete frenzy of fighting. And again, when you combine all the advantages they had materially, the wagons and the adventures, the domesticated horse, the chariots and all that, and you combine that with this intense fighting style, again, these guys were unstoppable. All teenagers had to go on a cattle raiding as a rite of passage, and that was sort of to see who's good at this, who are the potential soldiers. Again, it was a totally militarized culture. Even the religion, The god Odin chooses the best warriors to spend the afterlife in Valhalla, where others engage, where they simply keep engaging in combat. So after you die, you continue to engage in combat. And this, I love this quote from Hasenfratz. He says, Odin's nature is one of wandering, unrest, and the destructive and creative transgression of boundaries. Through war, legal breaches, the censorious acts of the Mannerbund, ecstasy, magic, and the poetic arts, he repeatedly breaks down the rigid structure of normality. In doing so, he simultaneously makes room for the new, the unheard of, and the uncommon, and for movement and change. There's a huge dynamism in Western history, and I think this is part of that, of what that psychologically that means, that you're breaking everything down, a completely militarized culture, adventure, gain, fame, that's the name of the game. A quote from Ricardo Duchesne, the expansionist aggression of the West is an inescapable expression of its roots in these aristocratic men who are free and therefore headstrong and ambitious, sure of themselves, easily offended, unwilling to accept quiet subservience. The highly strung and obstinate aristocrat has been a fundamental source of destruction in Western history, as well as a source of all that is good and inspiring. But it's important to realize when these guys, they were so successful militarily, when they went into a new area, they did not exterminate the people. They subjugated them. So the hunter-gatherers that we talked about at the beginning were not wiped out. Those genes are still there. We can actually prove that now. I'll show you a population genetic study. They did not wipe out those people that were there. And they didn't even have rigid barriers between themselves and the new peoples. There were no permanent ethnic barriers. When the Goths went into Roman areas in Spain and France, they did not completely separate themselves from the Romans. For a while, maybe a generation, it was pretty separate, but didn't take very long, and they were intermarrying, and there were no boundaries at all. So the other group I want to talk about are the European hunter-gatherers. These are the first group. These are the people that were there forever, prior to the ice ages and all that. The German population geneticist Fritz Lenz, around 1930, developed the idea that there was the evolution of the Nordics was in the harsh environment of the ice ages, and so there were less between-group competition. It was more about fighting with nature. You had a very difficult environment up there. You had to deal with environmental adversity, more so than you had to deal with other groups of humans. And so you didn't have the clan-type society. Instead, you had a very individualistic society based on hunting and gathering. You had natural selection for intelligence because it's difficult to make a living in the north. There is a climb, as we say, in intelligence. And IQ research shows that if you go from the equator north, gradually IQs get higher in general. And a tendency towards social isolation. They're not, again, they're not selected for these intense group type things. These people are less ethnocentric. European hunter-gatherers, again, as Lenz would say, they were less selected for between-group competition, more for dealing with adversity in the environment. But their family structure, mom, dad, and the kids, we call it it's monogamous, and that is opposed to if you look at like in Islamic societies, you see extended family, or even in southwestern Europe, you have what we call compound families, where brothers and cousins all live sort of together. That was not the case in the north. It was basically the mom, dad, and the kids. And if you made a new family, you moved out and established your own situation. You had bilateral kinship. In the clan-type societies, you tend to have the kinship tends to run just through the father's line, so more status for the female line. This is just a graph showing that inventions are more common in individualistic societies. We tend to be, it's easier for us to sort of not think on the same page. We are able to think out of the box a little bit, invent new things. I think that's one of the advantages of individualism. So the idea is that you had natural selection for pair bonding and love. Which is very important for cementing families together, these nuclear families. We're not based on kinship, again, where you're just marrying your first cousin. Again, so common in the Middle East, basically cousin marriages are the norm. And essentially you have monogamy because it would not be ecologically possible for a man to support several wives and a bunch of children way up in the north, where he's got to hunt and gather food for all those people. That's just not going to happen. So instead of this tendency that we see really throughout the world of men, having all this competition for mates, and then having more than one wife, lots of children, and so on, you don't have that, and instead you have monogamy as the central tendency. And it's interesting because the polygamy leads to sexual competition, obviously, because males are going to be competing with each other for mates, and so they're trying to have more mates, have more wives, have more children. Monogamists, on the other hand, tend to be more cooperative. They are sort of less aggressive, and in fact, Peter Frost wrote a thing just recently, the anthropologist. Actually, they should sort of nicer people, more empathic. Collectivist societies, marriage tends to be arranged. It tends to be arranged through kinsmen, through family strategizing, and so on. With individualistic societies, it's based on personal choice. Do you get along with the other person? Is she attractive? Is he attractive? Is he able to make a good living? That kind of thing. Those are the things that are going to be the values. It's a free market system, essentially like we saw with the Indo-Europeans. This is a map of population genetics, and the idea is in the blue map there, as you go north in Europe, you have more hunter-gatherer genes. Again, the recent population genetic studies, they're able to actually pinpoint those genes. More common in the north, whereas the farmer genes are more common in the south of Europe. So these tendencies are what I'm talking about, this hunter-gatherer kind of mentality, more common in the north of Europe. These hunter-gatherer groups are fairly egalitarian. And and this is true around the world. When you see hunter-gatherer groups, wherever they are really, they tend to be egalitarian. They tend to have a consensus form of leadership. You don't have despots. If one guy tries to be a despot, they tend to get rid of him, they murder him, they throw him out or something like that. So it's what we call egalitarian individualism. No one should rise above the others, at least not too much. And again, it's common in all other hunter-gatherer groups studied. Christopher Veyman, USC, is the anthropologist who's really studied this. And so in Scandinavia, you have what they call the Jante laws. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but notice these laws. And again, if you go to Sweden, and I have gone there a couple times, everybody knows about these things. It's a common part of Swedish culture. Don't think you are anything. Don't think you are as good as us. Don't think you're smarter than us. Don't fancy yourself that you're greater than us. Don't think you're good for anything. In other words, total egalitarian mindset that other people are not above you in any way. With individualism, personal goals rather than group goals become much more important. Socialization emphasizes self-reliance and independence. And we have more positive attitudes towards strangers. I think that's sort of killing us now, obviously. That's going to be the sort of punchline here. If you're nice to strangers, I guess that means in Germany now you're admitting as many refugees as want to come to Germany. But the idea is that they're more likely to behave in a pro-social or even altruistic way to strangers. And actually, my own family, two of my aunts actually died in India as medical missionaries back in the 1930s, ministering to people in India. And that's very common now. We see a lot of white people who, sacrifice themselves or adopt black babies and that sort of thing. And now, of course, the whole thing in Europe is adopting with refugees. So one of the big traits here is empathy and what we call pathological altruism, which is not based on kinship. In other words, your empathy is not directed at your close kin, it's directed at everybody. I was just talking with Sam Dixon, this Quaker had the idea, he couldn't understand why he should raise his own children rather than someone on the other side of the world. There's no reason to prefer your own children. You should be as empathic to someone in Somalia as in your own child. So you have this this universalist form of empathy, which I don't know any other culture that does it. This is one of these unique things about our culture that is problematic now in the 21st century. This is a bell curve for the trait of empathy, which is linked to we talked about love and affection as the basis of the nuclear family, and it basically goes, if you take 4 standard deviations below the mean, you have true sociopaths like Bill Clinton. He's always my paradigm of a sociopath, So Tony Blair is another one. If you know anything about British politics, as soon as I mention Tony Blair, everybody agrees with me on that. And then, if you're 2, you're sort of cold and aloof. And then if you're +1 or +2, that's sort of normal. You have good family relationships. You're nurturing to your children, not to everybody's children. It's compartmentalized. In other words, you have affection for your children, but you don't have affection for everybody's children. You don't care about your neighbor's children particularly. So it's focused more on family, close friends. But when you get up to the right-hand side of this distribution, you become kind of crazily altruistic, pathologically altruistic, and what we call dependency disorder. Dependency disorder is a disorder where you just have these intense relationships and are oftentimes not reciprocated. It's the woman who takes care of the alcoholic husband, takes care of the husband that beats her and all that kind of stuff. You give too much in relationships, but you're totally dependent. You can't get along without it. And of course, women are higher than men on this system. That's why we see women are more enthusiastic about adopting babies from overseas and that kind of thing. And I think you can see it in voting patterns. The sex difference in voting patterns, I think, essentially is about this. Men are more cynical, we're a little colder, we're objective about things. So I'm just going to have one brief, just talk about, in the 19th century, the racial scientists viewed idealism as a trait of Nordic peoples. And that is the idea that these universalist ideas are erected, and then you try to achieve them by changing your society. Certainly one of the groups that represent that the best are the Puritans, the Yankee Puritans. Very common to have these utopian communities in the 19th century. They'd set up rules, and this is how we're going to have a community, the Brooks Farm community in Massachusetts. And then they would invite people to come, but they'd have to live by the rules, but it was supposed to be a sort of utopian, ideal community. Almost all of them broke down sooner or later. And the anti-slavery movements, which were dominated by the Quakers in England and the Puritans in America, basically were very idealistic. They setting up a world that didn't exist now, but they had a moral ideal. They wanted to achieve it, get rid of slavery as an evil. So morality is not defined as what is good for the group. It's defined as what is by an abstract moral ideal. Kant's moral imperative, act according to the maxim that you should, at the same time that it could become a universal law. That is the kind of universal morality I think is central to Western thinking about morals, and it's quite foreign to other peoples. Moral idealism involves consensus building and control. And again, kinship is weak, so how do you form a cohesive group? Well, you have a sense of what is moral, essentially. Individualism implies equality of interest, and it really creates a morally defined in-group. That's the point I want to make. A morally defined in-group. It's not defined by ethnicity, not by kinship, but by conformity to a moral ideal. And shame for not going along with that, guilt, and internal control. In other words, you are motivated internally. You don't have to know about punishments and all that. You feel guilty if you make a transgression, even if nobody else knows about it. You have a consensus moral culture. So reputation becomes the sort of measure of all things. Personal honesty, integrity, upholding moral norms. Whereas collectivist cultures are far more family-oriented. They've done social science studies. People over in India are far more likely to privilege their family, whereas people in America, these more individualist societies, are much more likely to take an abstract moral judgment and say stealing is wrong. I don't care if it helps your family, kind of thing. Or over in India, Africa, these other places, morality has much more to do with, does it help me or my family? That's essentially what morality is. In the West, these moral ideals are abstract, and they are things that you have to adhere to if you want to be part of a moral community. As is often said, individualist societies have high levels of public trust, low levels of corruption. But there's also a strong conformity to group norms. If you look in detail at these Puritan groups, at the Quaker groups, there was a lot of sort of spying on everybody to make sure they were on the same page, that somebody wasn't fooling around with another woman or doing, blaspheming against God or something like that. A lot of surveillance state. They would actually encourage people to go around and look in the windows of people's houses to see what was going on there. And we sort of see, our present society is rapidly becoming that with all the high-tech surveillance equipment available now. If you do ignore these group norms, of course, you become ashamed and guilty. You lose your reputation. You'll be ostracized. People won't associate with you. You'll be out of the group. In the same way that, if you're in these kinship groups, your status is determined by kinship. In these groups, your status is determined, do you agree to the moral basis of the society? So psychologically, what's going on is you have the cortex up there, the higher part of the brain, and all these media messages, and the things you get from your professors in the university, saying that pro-white attitudes are evil, that multiculturalism is a good thing, that essentially what they are doing is creating a moral community. That's what the media is up to. That's what the academic world is up to. Creating a moral community to shun people who disagree with it, to make them feel guilty and all that. So the idea is that the cortex is actually able to inhibit the lower part of the brain, so-called. So here you have you do have pro-white attitudes. Like Phil Rushton's research on similarity, that people are attracted to people who are similar to them genetically. That is, that's part of the lower part of the brain. We're attracted to that. But the point is that the cortex can control it, can inhibit it. That's why I have the minus sign with the arrow going down. It controls those emotions, whereas those emotions are trying to go up, and they're trying to get into consciousness and dominate. But what we do know is that humans, because of the very powerful cortex and the very powerful media messages, they can win. This is how the media wins, and all these ideas are spread in the university. They're expressed in language, which is processed at the higher part of the brain, and it's able to actually inhibit what's going on at the lower part of the brain, inhibit people's so-called prejudice responses and so on. A lot of research on that. In my book, The Culture Critique, the point is that human evolution is now being fought out in the realm of ideas. Intellectual movements of the left, the moral imperative of immigration, of multiculturalism, the decline of evolutionary thinking, and the general loss of cultural confidence in the West have been major components of the huge unfolding evolutionary disaster. What I'm saying is that this has been a top-down revolution, in two ways. One way is simply this. This is top-down, isn't it? It starts at the top with the media messages, things you get in your textbooks, and so on, and filters down. It controls the lower part of your brain. And of course, the people doing that are the elite in the society, the people that run our society. Essentially, these movements have created moral communities that are hostile to the interests of Europeans. And the one example, quickly here, the Puritans came from East Anglia, relatively small social class differences. They were quite egalitarian, very much into these utopian ideas, the higher law. They made all these utopian communities in the 19th century. they're also willing to impose great costs on themselves to punish others. You know, if you think about the Civil War, they were able to, they were willing to punish people, even going to war or something like that, to punish what they saw as evil. And they did. They were the main group opposed to slavery in America. But again, very strong community control, surveillance society. Everybody had to stand in line. Very little, a very small amount of criminal violence, but and these abolitionists, again, this is a textbook case of moral idealism, framing African slaves as members of a common humanity. Here's a quote from the Reverend James Ramsey. The idea is to gain to society, to reason, to religion, 500,000 of our kind, bold and italicized, our kind, equally with us adapted for advancing themselves in every art and science that can distinguish man from man, equally with us capable of looking forward to and enjoying futurity. Of course, that's the ideology that is with us today, isn't it? That is liberalism in a nutshell. Obviously, they appealed to empathy to do this. This is a medallion that circulated at the time. You have the supplicating black man. You feel sorry for him. He's in chains, and so on. So in conclusion, basically, what I'm pitching here is that there are two great currents of Western culture. One, the Indo-European part that essentially is military culture, very aristocratic, very hierarchical, egalitarian within the group, and it was individualistic in the sense it had a sort of market economy of upward mobility. But then you had the hunter-gatherer culture, stemming more from the more common in the north of Europe, what we call egalitarian individualism. Moral conformity and reputation is really important, policing the morals of the group. And the basic story of the last few centuries has been the triumph of egalitarian individualism, whether it's the Civil War, certainly you know, all of the revolutions and since the modern era, since I think the English Civil War, have been to sort of denigrate the Indo-European aristocratic element in favor of this egalitarian individualism. So the Puritans really did run this country intellectually and every other way until around 1950, when you had the rise of these Jewish intellectual movements that I talk about. But the Puritans are very important for understanding American history. And there was a movement in the 1920s to sort of get it all back as a period of ethnic defense, spearheaded by people like Madison Grant and Lothrop Stoddard. But the problem they had was they did not dominate the universities. They did not dominate the media. And so they were swept aside when Franz Boas, dominating all the departments of anthropology, taking over the university, and of course the media became ever more on the side of the left. And so essentially they lost that war. And so after 1965, white ethnic defense collapsed with the rise of this new hostile elite. It was a relatively weak ethnocentrism of the previous Anglo elite. They're moral universal. They didn't have any principles. They didn't put up strong barriers between themselves and others. Others could break those barriers down, and they certainly did, whether it was law firms or universities. So in conclusion, just suggestions. We have to defend the traditional peoples of the West by saying, first of all, it is morally defensible. We want to make our own moral communities. White people need moral motivation. I don't think they can be motivated by simply saying, oh, those people have low IQ or something like that. We have to have a positive image of our own interests. The massive non-white immigration and the ideology of multiculturalism are evil, in one word. And we have to understand that as an evil, and we have to make a moral community built around those kinds of ideas. We have to emphasize the costs of multiculturalism. I'm not going to go into them here because spend a whole nother hour on that, but clearly more social conflict, more crime, and Coulter's been talking about that, more welfare use. You're going to have ethnic inequality because you have IQ inequality. You're going to have racialized politics. You know, Republicans are already the white party, and so on. we have to essentially make our own moral groups of people who agree with us and shun those who disagree. In short, we have to make white people self-conscious about their own tendencies towards hyper-moral, universalist, indiscriminately empathic individualism. Like other natural tendencies. In this case here, this individualism and moral universalism is on the bottom because it is a biological push. It's pushing up, but if we would understand that we have to suppress those things, then we would be a whole lot better off. In other words, we have to suppress these individualistic tendencies. We have to understand that defending our own rights and people is entirely morally legitimate. The opposite is obviously evil. Thank you.